Well, hello, just to introduce this video, this is another edition of talking about the predestination of God's elect. This time with Kevin of Kevin's Biblical Discussions. And I am once again playing the role of the J. Harlan Bretts of Predestination. So I joined him to try to explain to him what Paul was saying in Romans 8:28 to 30. Please enjoy. Do me a favor, give the video a like. And if you haven't, go ahead and subscribe and try to understand what I'm saying. All right, so watch the video and just listen to it, and the Lord can give the understanding in all.
Oh, that's fine. So yeah, we can get into the topic if you want, Jay. So what is it about Romans 8 that you disagree with about, like, so I identify as a provisionist, right? Like the traditional Southern Baptist soteriology. So I would actually have a large agreement with Leighton Flowers when he goes to Romans 8 and when it says, for whom he did foreknow, he did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son, that the foreknown, and a lot of Greek scholars would agree with this, it means to have known previously. So this isn't necessarily talking about a selected group from eternity past, but those who God knew previously. In other words, those who God knew before Paul wrote this letter, alluding back to like Old Testament saints.
All right,
Do you
so
agree with that?
yes and no. I probably should have listened to try to figure out everything that Leighton says about that, because I think he starts well, but then the train derails. So I think
Yeah, so
his
the predestination
understanding
in verse 9, or I'm sorry, in verse 30, the predestination is to the end result, not to the beginning, right? So, Calvinists would usually say, like, God has predestined certain individuals to be Christians. But I don't believe that's what predestination is. Those who are in Christ are predestined to be conformed to his image, which means to be glorified, which means the rapture, given a glorified body, the resurrection. So those who are in Christ are predestined to the end result, not the beginning.
All right. That's what I would like to challenge you. What I was trying to say or going to say is I should have listened to Leighton so I know where he starts out. Like I say, for whom he did foreknow, that is correct. He's talking about people in the Old Testament. But that's what Leighton would say about verse 29. What he would say about verse 30, however, he brings that to us. And what you just said, we are predestinated to. How would you how would you explain verse 30?
Okay, so whom he foreknew or knew previously, he did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. And then he's saying that the same ones he predestinated are the same ones he called and justified, and those are the same ones he glorified. So this is a
Question
past
to you,
event. Yeah, go ahead.
are you in verse 30?
Yes, I wouldn't have a problem with putting saints today in verse 30.
All right. So that's where I think and I think Leighton does the same thing. So maybe I can try to give my explanation of these verses and just as brief as possible. Okay, so if you scroll down just a little bit, so they'll have verse 28 on the screen. So we have 28. Okay, so, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. So I guess I would say that I believe that Paul is writing to the church at Rome, and he has, there are people who say he's writing to Jews and Gentiles. Yes. So
Mhm.
in in chapter 7, he says, I speak to you that know the law, right? So he's talking to Jews that know the Old Testament. And well, I assume he's talking to Jews that know the Old Testament. There could be some Gentiles that either A or B, either A, they also knew the Old Testament, or B, if they had any questions about the Old Testament, they had Jews in their midst that they could ask the questions of. So they would have everyone, Jew and Gentile, would have had ability to understand what he was saying. So,
and don't forget to like and subscribe.
He's writing to people who know the Old Testament. And so I believe that what he does here is what he does, not just him, but so this everyone who wrote in the New Testament, all the writers, from time to time, going to refer to things in the Old Testament. And it's not just the people who wrote in the New Testament that refer to things in the Old Testament. It's also people who didn't write. Like there was one time when Jesus was talking to people, and they said, "We have heard out of the law that Christ abideth forever, and how sayest thou the Son of Man must be lifted up?" So they were referring back to the scripture to try to make their point. I believe right here, Paul makes this statement in verse 28. We know that all things work together for good. So once he makes that statement, then he goes on to back it up. And basically, if I'm not mistaken, Paul has been talking about suffering in some previous verses. And I think he's saying that in spite of the fact that people are suffering, we know that all things are going to work together for good, because it worked together for good to the people in the Old Testament. So some people, I've heard more than one people, I don't know, at least 3, 4, 5, sometimes when people quote Romans 8:28, and they'll use Joseph as an example of someone for whom things work together for good. And I think that's the same thing Paul was doing in verse 29. And so because he's referring to people in the Old Testament in verse 29, I think he continues talking about people in the Old Testament in verse 30, but not just everyone in the Old Testament. I think you'd have to look back and see who was called, who was justified, who was glorified. So, for example, we know that God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees. I think it's that kind of call, people who he spoke with. Now, the Bible tells us that Lot went with him from Ur of the Chaldees, but Lot was not he was not called the same way Abraham was. So I believe it would apply to Abraham, but not necessarily Lot, even though the Bible says he was a righteous man. But I don't know that Lot was called. So I think he's talking about people that are types of Christ. If we look at people who are types of Christ, we can see that things work together for their good. Like I just mentioned, Joseph, things work together for his
where
good.
are types of Christ mentioned in Romans 8?
In verse 29, when he says, "For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son." I take it.
Yeah, this is talking about
Okay,
the
so
resurrection of Christ. This is talking about the last day.
how do we establish that it's talking about the last day? But let me explain. Have you heard my
Because,
explanation of conform to the image of his Son?
good.
Go ahead. Okay, so it's talking about types of Christ in verse. In verse, let me just do verse 39. Excuse me, 29. All right. So if he's talking about people in the Old Testament, then you would say that people in the Old Testament were predestinated to be conformed to the image of his Son.
Yes.
All right. So that's what I believe, but I believe he's talking about types of Christ. So I would just use for an example Jonah. I take it that conformed to the image of his Son means that some aspect of the life of Christ, ministry of Christ, or whatever you want to put it, can be seen in that person. Jesus mentioned Jonah. He said, and as Jonah was in the heart of the great fish or something like that for 3 days and 3 nights. Even so, the Son of Man shall be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. So the aspect of the life of Christ that we can see in Jonah, who is a type of Christ, is the fact that we see the death, burial, and resurrection, not just in Jonah, but we do see it in Jonah. And so I'm saying that the way Jonah was predestinated to be conformed to the image, that is to say, the way Jonah was predestinated to be an icon of Christ, is by God sending him to Nineveh, knowing full well that Jonah, the Bible doesn't use this word, but I'll say Jonah hardened his heart. God knew that Pharaoh was going to harden his heart. He would have also known that Jonah was going to harden his heart. So Jonah heard the word from the Lord, go to Nineveh, and he went the other way. God knew he was going to do that. That's why he chose him, because that once he fled toward Nineveh, God would send a storm. And God knew that once he sent the storm, Jonah would still be obstinate. And instead of repenting, he said, throw me overboard. I think Jonah thought that was going to be the end for him. But God had prepared a great fish to swallow him. Then Jonah wound up in the fish, and
thing is, if you reading Romans 8, if you start at verse 20, verses 20 through 23 give you the context for what he's going to continue to talk about. He says, for the creation itself was made subject to vanity.
Excuse me, Jason is making a bunch of noise. Go ahead.
Okay, for the creation itself was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who has subjected in the same expectation, because the creation itself shall also be delivered from the bondage of corruption to the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and travaileth in pain together until now, and not only they, but ourselves also, not only them, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For we are saved by expectation, but expecting that is seen not is not expected for. What a man sees, why does he yet expect for? But if we expect for what we see not, then we do with patience wait for it. So what are they waiting for? The redemption of the bodies. That's the conforming to his image. So verse 23, Paul explains what the conforming in his image is when he gets down here to verse 29. The conform to his image is the redemption of the body mentioned up here in verse 23.
I don't see that connection. So let me ask you, are you saying being conformed to his image is future, or it's
correct?
So right now you would say no one has been conformed to the image of God's Son?
Correct.
All right. So my problem with that is that it appears to me that they have been, because those people, again, going back to the types of Christ, those types of Christ in verse
Deal with the
29 and 30.
passage. No, because verse 23 tells us that we're waiting for the redemption of our bodies.
Okay, it does, but when does that happen?
At the last day.
Where does it say that the redemption of the body happens at the last day? Well, no, that's not the question. The
First
question is, what does it?
Thessalonians.
Okay, that was the wrong question. The question is, why are you tying the redemption of the body into being conformed to the image of Christ? What does it mean to be conformed to the image
Because
of
Paul
God's
does.
Son?
Paul talks
Where?
about how the sons of God are waiting for the creation to be redeemed from corruption, and that we're waiting for the redemption of our bodies, which is the adoption. Then he goes on and he says, all things work together for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And then he goes on to talk about who he foreknew, and then he predestinated to be conformed to the image of his son. Listen, to be conformed to the image of his son means to be spotless, means to be perfect, right? And none of us are that yet. We're saved, but we're not perfect. We're waiting for the body.
But how do you Okay. Did you understand what I'm saying it is to be conformed to the image of his son?
Yeah, you're saying conform to the image of his son just means to be a type of Christ, like a prophet, right?
That just like with Jonah, we can see his death, burial, and resurrection. Um,
Yeah, but I'm not a type of Christ, nor are you. None of us are.
right, 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 right.
We're his
So
children, but we're not types of Christ. Moses was a
that's
type of Christ. I'm not.
right. So I'm saying we are not in verse 29. We are not in verse 30. We are in verse 28. However,
Okay. So you think we're in verse 28. So we are called
yes.
according to his purpose, but he didn't. We're not some of those that were foreknown or known previously. And we're
All
not
right.
predestinated to
So,
be conformed to the image of Jesus.
all right. So, for whom he did foreknow,
Well, I'm in verse 29.
and
Are we predestinated to be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ?
no, he's talking about people. You yourself said he's talking about people in the Old Testament, correct?
Yes. Well, that's what he when he talks about foreknowing, but that same conformity, the resurrection, we're going to partake in that.
I I can tie being conformed to the image of his son to being a type of Christ because if you remember, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I speak Greek. I do not. But my understanding is the image part is the word icon. And once Jesus used that word, someone asked him if he, no, if it was lawful to pay tribute to Caesar or not. And he said, "Give me a penny." And he said, "Whose image does this penny have?" I may not use the word penny, but he asked for a coin. He didn't use the word coin. Image, it had the image of Caesar, but that was not Caesar. It was just an image of him. People could see Caesar in the coin. People can see parts of Jesus in Moses. People can see aspects of the life of Jesus in Joseph, in Jonah, and in various people. So that's what I'm saying. It means to be conformed to the image. You can see, just like a coin has an image in it.
Can I
When you
ask a
see that,
clarifying question? Do
sure.
you do you do you agree that verse 23 is talking about the resurrection, a future resurrection?
Yes,
Okay. So
yes.
here's my
Okay,
problem.
I can go with that.
Why would Paul introduce the resurrection? He's talking about, see, in verse 23, he talks about the resurrection of our human bodies to being perfect. And up here, he's talking about the restoration of the entire of creation, the earth itself, from verses 19 to 21. And then 23, he mentions our bodies. We get a glorified body. And he keeps going and talking about we're waiting for this. Then he talks about the Spirit helps us with our infirmities and we don't pray like we should, and the Spirit searches because he knows the hearts of men and he makes intercession for the saints. And then he goes on to say all things work together for the good of those who love God, and you agree that we're in verse 28, which is good. But then when we get down here where it talks about being conformed to his image, why do you exclude um us from that? It seems to me that Paul is tying in the resurrection from verse 23 here in verse 29, that we're going to be conformed to the image of his son.
All right, so he was talking about suffering, and then he's saying it's not just we that are suffering or can suffer, will suffer, but the whole creation is groaning together. But they are going to be delivered from that as we are at the end of the time. So even though you might be suffering now, you might have it hard. We know that all things are going to work together for good to them that love God. How do we know that?
Right.
Because it worked out good for David. I think
Well,
the
I would just say
people,
because God says so. That's all. That's what I would say, because
well,
God says it does.
right, but Paul went on to illustrate how we know that it's going to work together for good by using people that it worked for whom it worked out in the Old Testament. Like, as I'm saying,
Okay.
Joseph.
So if we're going to take your understanding of conform to the image, which just means it's talking about types of Christ, from the past, right? Like shadow fulfillments and things like what in within the Romans 8 passage here itself necessitates that interpretation. Why is that? Why do you think that interpretation is correct versus the other way of thinking about it?
All right. I believe that verse 29 and 30 are talking about the same people. It doesn't go from one people to another. The same people that are mentioned in verse 29 are the verse who are the ones who are mentioned in verse 30. So if he's talking about Old Testament people in verse 29, then you have to go to the Old Testament and ask yourself who was called by God in the Old Testament? Who was called, who was justified, who was glorified, and to whom would you say the things that happened to them did not happen by chance? We would say, I just explained that Jonah being swallowed by, we'll just call it a whale. Jonah being swallowed by the whale was not by
Well, before you
chance.
continue on though, so are you saying that there is nothing in this passage that necessitates your understanding? You're saying that if we go to the Old Testament, you can try to tie it in. Is that what you're doing?
That's what Paul's doing. He's testing. We agree that Paul is talking about people in the Old Testament in verse 29, for whom he did foreknow.
Well, not
People
just
who
the
he
Old
knew in the
Testament.
past.
Anyone foreknown is it's referring to anyone before he even wrote this letter. All the people of the past that God foreknew, not
I
just Old
don't think you
Testament
can.
saints. Yeah.
I see. I think everyone is getting that wrong, and it's because of God's great knowledge. Yes. So, who did God not foreknow? Can you did God foreknow Esau, for example?
Anyone who's not saved is not foreknown.
Can you support that biblically?
Um. Yeah, I could go to Matthew 7, where it's the same Greek word, gnosko, where Jesus says, I never knew you. I believe it's the same Greek
Mm,
word.
okay, new is different from foreknow or foreknew, correct?
Y- Well, yeah, in the English, but I'm pretty sure it's the same Greek word or a derivative. Hold on, let me check. Let me see here. Oh, I'm sorry. So foreknow is prognosko. Let me see which word is in Matthew 7.
We interrupt this broadcast to ask one question. Have you liked the video yet? If not, please do so. Thank you. And now back to your regularly scheduled program, talking about the predestination of God's elect. One of the
So,
reasons,
oh no, I'm sorry. It's not the same word. This is just gnosko.
right? So then
Okay.
the support you have for your interpretation has fallen. I would say that there's no one who God did not know beforehand. So what about Judas? Did
Well, I
God
mean,
foreknow Judas?
salvifically, like he intimately knows his people. He does not intimately know the lost.
That verse, nowhere does it say he intimately knew or did not intimately know. So we agree that he's talking about people in the Old Testament. The reason why I say that is because Paul uses the same word in Acts chapter 5. Excuse me, check that 26 and 5. And he's talking about people who knew him in the past, right there. Um, but you had it, but it disappeared. So if Paul
What?
uses the, can you go pull up Acts 26:5 right there?
Acts
All right,
26,
right
5.
there. It was the link to it was on the when you were looking up that word. All right,
Acts 26,
Acts
5.
26 and 5, which
Which knew
knew
me
me
from the
from the beginning, if
okay.
they would testify. So these are people who knew Paul in the past, correct? Well,
From the beginning of
go
his
to
ministry.
the,
Yeah.
what is the other one you have? The with the Strongs. Pull it up with the Strongs. KJV plus. Okay,
So the word knew there, it's prognosko.
right. So right here, Paul is using this to say people which knew me in the past. What
Okay.
if he's talking about people who knew him from the beginning, from before he was a Christian? What would I don't know the best way to put that. People who knew me in the past, who
Hmm.
knew me before. If Paul is using this word right here, prognosko, to talk about people who knew him in the past, he's not talking about people who, as far as I know, he doesn't indicate that he's talking about people who had an intimate relationship with him or the people who loved him from his past. They just knew him before he was a Christian. If Paul uses it like that right here, what is the justification for saying it's people who God knew intimately? What is the justification for that? If you
Hmm.
look at that verse, that 28, 29, 30 in a certain way, then saying it's people who God knew intimately previously, then it fits. But you have to, in a manner of
Well,
speaking,
because part of the
beg the
definition
question.
to be previously acquainted with, you could qualify that as to know intimately.
How do you justify that? Based on the uses in Acts 26:5. Now, I don't know chronologically, is this the first time it's used in the Bible? There are people who have a thing about,
I don't
not
know.
sure what they call it, first use doctrine or something. The first use
Oh,
of the
the law
word is
first mention.
law first mentioned. I don't
Yes.
necessarily subscribe to that, but
Okay.
is not this the first mention of gnosko?
In Acts
If it
26,
is the
I'm not sure.
if it is, then why would we switch to a different meeting about intimacy or knowing people intimately when it appears in Romans 8? So I think we have two choices here as far as the first mention of this prognosko. Either it's first used in Acts 26:5 or it's first used in Romans 8. Was it 29 or 30?
Well, Acts
29.
comes before Romans, so
Right, but it's
yeah.
possible that he all right, so let's just assume then for I don't know if you say argument's sake, the first use is in Acts. Why are we going to change the meaning? The way I put it, it fits perfectly people who God knew in the past, just like Paul's talking about people who he knew in the past. God knew the types of Christ in the past, the people who he called, like Moses, like Joshua, like
Yeah, but the problem
David.
with you saying that those types of Christ is not in the passage. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say types of Christ.
But neither's the people whom God knew intimately. That what does it mean to be conformed to the image of his son? That means, as I said, that word is
Glorification.
icon. Okay. I think you may have
Like up
tried
here in verse
to
23, the redemption of the body, that's what it means to be conformed.
you're putting those, it appears to me that you're putting those two things together because that's
Paul
the way
does.
you have to. I don't see how he does that. He
Because he mentions it first. He talks about all of creation being redeemed, redeemed, made perfect, and then Christians are made perfect at the adoption. And then he goes on to explain that God's doing this for those he foreknew. And then I have no reason why would God glorify saints of the past but not do it for saints of today?
okay.
That doesn't make sense.
I No one's saying he's not doing it for saints of the day. So then the question would be, what does it mean to be glorified?
Right. I mean, because you do believe in a future resurrection of the just, right?
Yes, a future
Right.
resurrection of everyone. Actually, it's not just the
Well,
just,
I
but
mean,
yes,
yes,
the
the
just.
damned get brought up to be judged and cast into like a fire. The righteous get brought up to be judged at the judgment seat of Christ for rewards.
All right.
But I think that's
So
what Paul's talking about in Romans 8. I think he's talking about the resurrection of the just at the last day. That's where I'm coming from with it.
all right. So the way that Jonah was predestinated to be conformed to the image of his son. To be an icon of Christ is his disobedience. God knew he was going to
See,
disobey.
but again, icon of Christ, that's not in but that's not in Romans 8 though. That's not biblical language here. It just says conform to his image. You're eisegeting. That means a type of Christ.
Image is icon, right? Well, let
I
me
don't
ask you
actually
this
know what
question.
that is, actually.
Let me ask you this: the
Yes.
people you would say are types of Christ, do you think that they were predestinated to be types? That is to say, God worked those things to happen the way they happened so that they would be types, or that they just happened? The things that
Oh
just
no.
happened, the things that
Yeah.
happened to David, the things that happened to Joseph and Moses.
So I think God did predestine Moses to be a prophet. Same thing with David. Same thing with Samson. All that. Yep. I think he predestined Paul
Okay.
and the others to be apostles. I think that's what Ephesians 1 is mostly talking about, is that he chose them to be apostles. Um. So I do believe
So
some things are
can
determined, but I don't
just
believe. Yeah. Go ahead.
can I interrupt? You just said that you think God predestined Moses to be a prophet. I'm not asking that. I'm asking, was he predestined to be a type, or did the things that make him a type happen in a normal course of life, or was it predestined? Not necessarily just being a prophet, because I think the people in verse 29 are, let's say, prophets like Moses. We could say potentates like King David. We could say patriarchs like Joseph. And we could say priests like Melchizedek. And I don't know if we could say princesses like Sarah. I don't know if she would fit in there or not, but, and that was just a little bit of alliteration, but those are the people in verse 29, the one who did foreknow. He foreknew priests, prophets, potentates, that is to say, kings and patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on and so forth. And you look at all those people, I don't know that
So
God
do
specifically
you
called
are
every king, but there are
so
kings who God did call.
does verse 29 have anything to do with salvation
No,
in your
not
opinion? No.
not
Okay.
not directly. No, not yes and no. Because he called Abraham, right? So he could be a blessing to all nations. That is to say, through that Christ would come through him, and salvation was coming through those people. Those people
Amen.
point to Christ. So it has to do with salvation in as much as the things that happen to those people happen to point to Christ and to point, like the people didn't know that Moses was pointing to Christ so much. They only know he mentioned that the prophet would come. So we can see that what Moses did pointed to Christ. But yeah, those in verse 29, no, not directly with salvation. I do not think so.
Okay. Well, I'm just confused. Then I don't know what's going on.
All right, let me try to explain this one more time, and I'm
Because
just
I
going to
mean, when you
start.
say people are made types of Christ, that doesn't make sense to me because there's certain
Okay,
people that like
name
not
someone
all
you
Old
could say
Testament.
is a type of Christ.
Well, Joseph was because he represented redemption um out of the famine, right, for his people. His brothers and his
Okay,
father came to Egypt and they were redeemed out of the famine. So that shows he's a type of Christ, right? It was a symbolic savior. But not all the
let
Old
me
Testament
let
saints were that.
so this is, if I said previously that I'm not talking about all the Old Testament saints because I made a distinction between Lot and Abraham. I'm saying yes, Abraham
Okay.
is in this set,
Well,
but
why don't you
Lot,
just
though the
clearly
Bible
give your
says he was.
position and I'll shut up for a little while and just try to listen because I don't know where you're coming from.
All right, so let me go
Go ahead.
with Joseph. Let me go with Joseph. So the way that God predestinated Joseph to be a type of Christ, the way that God predestinated Joseph to be conformed to the image of his son, the way that God predestinated Joseph to be an icon, that is the image, an icon of Christ, is not the only way, but partly through the dreams that Joseph had. So when his brothers wanted to kill him, they said, "Behold, this dreamer cometh." They mentioned his dream. They said, "Let us kill him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." So part of their hatred of him was his dreams. It wasn't the only thing, but those dreams, it's not just dreams that Joseph had. There would have been God speaking to Joseph through the dream, not just through Joseph, not just to Joseph, also to his father and his brethren. Part of the way God predestinated Joseph was through the dreams, not just through the dreams, though. It was him being bought by Potiphar when he got to Egypt, for Potiphar's wife taking a liking to him for Joseph standing strong and resisting being cast into prison, being forgotten for 2 years, and then interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh. That is part of how God predestinated Joseph to be conformed to the image, that is to say, to be an icon of Christ, to be a type of Christ. The things didn't happen by accident. Part of the way that God predestinated Moses to be an icon of Christ is just the fact of him being found by Pharaoh's daughter. That did not happen by chance. That was God predestinating Moses to be a type of Christ, to put him in position to be a type of Christ. Once Moses is in the house of Pharaoh, he eventually refuses to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So I think we can say, just like in Ephesians, check that Philippians chapter 2, the Bible tells us that Jesus humbled himself and took on the form of a servant. Moses humbled himself when he was in Pharaoh's house and said, "I'm going to suffer affliction with the people of God." So all those things happened in the past. And I believe he's talking about people in the past in verse 28. And all the verses, the verbs, don't speak Greek, but the verbs in verse 30 are all in the past. And the part where he says that he might be the firstborn among many brethren, I would explain that this way. Jesus was talking to the people once, and he said, I just won't give the preamble. He said, "The people of Nineveh shall rise up with this people in judgment and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonas, and behold, a greater than Jonah is here." So greater than is the same as firstborn among many. So there are many types of Christ. So Jesus is greater than all of those. He mentioned also Solomon himself as being greater than Solomon. The queen of the south shall rise up with this generation in judgment and shall condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, a greater than Solomon is here. So all those types of Christ, we know of Christ, right? Jesus is greater than those. So he is the firstborn among many brethren. I can't tell you every person that's in those verses, because I don't know everyone who's a type of Christ.
Okay.
But we all would say that Jesus is greater than. So one more thing. So there's a time when in John chapter 9, Jesus had healed the blind man, and the blind man is going back and forth with the Pharisees and such. And they ask him a question, and he says, "I already told you, wherefore would you hear it again? Would you also be his disciples?" And they said, "We are Moses' disciples." And they said, "You're his disciple, but we're Moses' disciples." So they counted Moses as being higher than Christ, as Moses, between Christ and Moses, for them, Moses was the firstborn. But no, the reason why all these things happen, so that Christ would be the firstborn among many brethren. It's not just that he's higher than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There'll be, even though he is higher than those, if those were the only people that he was higher than, or the only people that were in those verses, then there'll be just a few brethren, but it's many brethren. So then I will stop and pause and ask, have you understood what I'm trying to say?
Well, there's one thing I want you to consider, because I think you're wrong, and I'm not claiming I have everything figured out either. But the word conformed is painting a picture of being like molded or shaped into something, right? So what it's
Oh,
saying is that people had been predestined to be shaped or conformed, molded into the image of Jesus. And this is why I think it lends more towards the interpretation of the resurrection. Because at that last day, when we are raised from the dead, the glorification of our bodies, according to verse 23, that's when we are molded into the image of Jesus. I think that's why the resurrection fits this context better than what you are bringing forth.
but what you just said matches up perfectly with what I said. I said that the things that happened to these people didn't happen by accident. They were predestined. The things that happened to Joseph is what molded him into the image of Christ. The things that happened to Jonah, the things that happened to
But
Moses,
but
and
but
so
but the
on and so
problem was that
forth.
these people weren't sinless in the past. So if we are being
But
conformed to his image, it would have to imply that they were made perfect, right? God
that
doesn't just
it would
partially
it
do
would
something.
only have it would only have to imply that they were made perfect if you could show from the Bible how it means being conformed to the image of Christ means to be made perfect. Where are you getting that from?
Verse 23, we even ourselves growing within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our bodies. Paul goes on, he keeps talking about that's how we're saved, is we're waiting for this future hope, this resurrection. Spirit helps our
Mm,
infirmities, and then all things work together for the good of those who love God. Then those he foreknew, he did predestinate to be conformed or molded into the image of his Son, so that he, singular, might be the firstborn among many brethren. Now, there's some people that say that the he in verse 29 is talking about Jesus because he was the first risen from the dead, and so we will be risen from the dead like Christ was. Um, yeah, I mean, either way, it doesn't matter. But I'm just saying that I think there's a stronger connection to the conformed being made perfect, resurrected, and I think earlier in the chapter supports this interpretation that Paul is alluding to, and he further expounds upon when he gets down here. I think it makes more sense to look at it that way. Now, I'm not saying I'm definitely right, but I mean, what you're presenting is like, if you're saying that, well, it's talking about Joseph and Moses were types of Christ, well, then that's an imperfect type, right? So that's not so if you're saying they were conformed in a past tense, it means it's completed action, it's done, right? They are justified, they are glorified. But that
yeah,
was
those
only
are
part of this. Not, it wasn't completed yet. They were
those
imperfect,
those verbs are in the past tense in verse 30. So yeah, that is
right?
completed because it's talking about people in the Old Testament, types of Christ. I I'm not I don't know. You went back up to 23, whatever. But in those verses that you went over, none of them says anything about being perfect or being made perfect.
Sir, if
I
we are
still don't know
given
where
a
you're getting the
glorified
perfect.
body, is the glorified body perfect? Will we ever sin again after the adoption, the redemption of our bodies? We'll be sinless, right?
I don't think so. I
So
sure
there's a
hope so.
possibility for us to sin in the new heaven and new earth. We're not going to be perfect.
I think we're reading that into there, waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. I don't
Okay,
think we're
let's
gonna.
start up again. Okay. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time, so that things that are going on now, are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed, future. For the earnest expectation of the creation manifest or waits for the manifestation of the sons of God, plural. For the creation itself was made subject to vanity, but not willingly, but by reason of him who subjected it in expectation, because the creation itself shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. So he's talking about there's this corruption. The whole earth has been corrupted with decay, destruction, death, sin. For we know that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now, not only they, but ourselves also. So Paul includes himself. He which has the first fruits of the Spirit even we, plural, groan within ourselves, plural, waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body, talking about the future glorification of the saints. For we are saved, salvation, by expecting, but hope that is not seen is not expected for. What a man sees, why does he yet expect for? But if we expect for what we see not, then we do patiently wait for it. So we're patiently waiting for the redemption of our bodies. Likewise, the Spirit also helps our infirmities, for we know that we should not pray for as we ought, but the Spirit Himself makes intercession for us with groanings that can't be uttered. And He searches the hearts and knows the mind of the Spirit, because He makes intercession for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that all things work together for good. Why? Because God is working them together for our good. Remember, right here, the saints are mentioned in verse 27. He makes intercession for the saints. Um,
I understand what you said, but I don't know that.
so when you keep going, anyway, when you get down here, where it's talking about being conformed to the image of His Son, I strongly believe that Paul has already told us what this means. Back up here.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Okay, I would beg to differ. I would say that
Okay.
when he
Well, then we just disagree. Then that's okay.
scroll up
I got
to verse
nothing more.
25.
Okay.
Okay, what you said, we are patiently waiting. All right. So, verse 25, in verse 25, we're patiently waiting. In verse 28, well, we know that while we're patiently waiting, all things are going to work together for good to them that love God, to
Right.
them who are the called of the according to His purpose. How do we know that all things are going to work together for good? Because it worked together for good for those people in the past. So he
Sure.
illustrates how we know by mentioning to people who knew the law, knew the Old Testament, he mentions how we know using the people in the Old Testament as an illustration. And then once he says, we know that all things work together for good, even though while we're patiently waiting, all things work together for good. So then after he says that, he says, then what shall we say to these things? In verse 31, if God be for us, who can be against us? We are patiently waiting. We have to suffer, some more than others. But we know that all things are going to work together for good. So what can we say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? Well, the people, some of the suffering is because the people are against them. They're against them, but they're not going to prevail. Even if they cause the death of someone, it's still going to work out to our good. We know this because of things work together for good. You can look at it, even at, if you look at Abel, and you say it's not good to die. Well, it worked out okay for Abel. Abel is one of the people, I think you could say, is glorified. He's well spoken of. He's justified. Just to me, that glorified and justified could be one or two things. It could be just what we all get as Christians. We're justified by faith and going to be glorified. But it also could be justified and shown to be they took the right course of action. Glorified could be just that the name, in a manner of speaking, is they have good names, among people who love God. That could be the glorified. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying that's a possibility, since I believe he is talking about people in the Old Testament in verse 29. And so the thing that I'm trying to say is this, that because of what I call the Augustinian paradigm. So Augustine didn't understand predestination. So he had an idea that it's God choosing these people and that people because of foreknowledge. But that doesn't say, these verses that we just read does not say anything about God doing those things because he knew them intimately. It's because he knew them in the past, just the same way
Well, you
that
would
the
agree
people,
God does ultimately know who will believe and who won't, right?
I would say God knows everyone. There's no one who God doesn't know.
But that's not what I asked you. I asked you, do you believe that because God's all knowing, he knows who will believe and who won't, right?
I will. Yeah, I don't have a problem saying that. Um,
Yeah. So I mean, even though I disagree with Augustine, I can understand why he comes away with that understanding here in Romans 8. Um, I mean, because just plainly looking at it, it does seem to appear like he's saying that God foreknows every Christian, everyone who's saved. He's foreknown, and then you could say based on his foreknowledge, he's predestined them to be glorified in verse
but so
23.
the
But
thing is, it doesn't say foreknowledge in verse 29. It says whom he did foreknow.
the foreknow,
Foreknowledge
right?
and foreknowing are two different things.
Okay,
And
okay.
so if we look at the uses of prognosko in Acts 26:5, we have no reason to change the meaning in verse 29. So if it's the same meaning in verse 29, then he's talking about people in the Old
So when you
Testament.
what is the difference?
As
Do you would you say
let me ask you
between
this.
fore? Go ahead.
Also, that word prognosko, I believe it's in Romans 11. Do you think he's talking about people in the past in Romans 11, or is he talking
Uh,
about everyone?
well, in Romans
11
11,
two.
he's talking about the nation of Israel. God has not cast away his people, which he foreknew. That's talking about Israel.
Israel, which he foreknew. Prognosko, it's the same prognosko as in 26:5, right? So that being the
Let me look.
case,
Yes, it is prognosko.
okay, so he can be used in the same way he knew Israel in the past. Um, those people knew Paul in the past before he was a Christian. He can be talking about people he knew before those days, Israel. So since it could be said that he's using prognosko here in Romans 11 the same way, people could say no, he's not, but we could say he's using it the same way he used it in Acts 26:5. Why would we have a different usage or meaning for it in Romans 8:29? Unless we're assuming that he's talking about people who he foreknew. I don't know. So foreknowledge
Yep.
is, I would say that God does not have foreknowledge.
What?
I would say that yeah, that sounds strange. I know. I would say he is not foreknowledge; it's just flat out knowledge. So
So you don't believe God knows things in advance or before?
no, not that he doesn't know things in advance. I'm just saying there's no need to
That
call
is
it.
foreknowledge.
There's
So if
no need.
God knows
There's
every human event
mm,
before the creation of the world, that's foreknowledge.
it's knowledge. Why would we call it foreknowledge when he doesn't call it foreknowledge? What does God
Foreknowledge means
call it? Knowledge.
excuse me, because foreknowledge means he knows something before it happens.
Isn't it? What's the difference in foreknowledge and knowledge in that case?
Okay, so knowledge would be just like general things like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Whereas
All right.
foreknowledge is like you're getting specific events or you know specific things before they happen.
Can you show that kind of usage in the Bible?
Not off the top of my head.
It's not in there. That's why you can't show it. But think about when, just think about a couple things in Genesis, Exodus.
So
Yeah,
free
that
grace alone 45 says that 1 Peter 1:2 he brings up as an example. Let's go there real
that's a
quick.
different word. That word is translated foreknowledge, but
Yeah,
it's
foreknowledge.
prognosis. The word is prognosis.
Well, there you go. The word for yeah, but didn't you say foreknowledge is not in the Bible? Well, there it is. There's the word.
No, no, you didn't understand. I'm saying it's not used the way you said. I said, show me that usage in the Bible. Show me the usage of you saying whatever you said that God has foreknowledge. I'm saying show that usage. This foreknowledge, that word is prognosis. So God knows he can give a prognosis of what I'm going to do, what you're going to do. So elect. So we're chosen to service based on God's knowledge
Sure.
of us. He doesn't just say, okay, let's take this one to do that. Um, think about David. He said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. So God's prognosis, his election of David to be king, his choice of David to be king was
Mhm.
because of his prognosis, which that word is translated
It's
foreknowledge,
foreknowledge.
but in look it up, that word, and tell me why it should be translated foreknowledge. What is the
What, the one
definition
here
of
in
the?
First Peter 1:2?
Yes,
Okay.
it's
So foreknowledge, let's go to the dictionary. Foreknowledge,
prognosis.
forethought, prearrangement.
So if it can be prearrangement, why did
To
they
know
translate it?
beforehand. Prior
Right.
acknowledgement, favorable recognition, or consideration beforehand. It's used to denote the foreordained fellowship of God with the objects of his saving power.
All right. So God elected David to serve based on his foreknowledge of David, right? That David was a
Correct.
man after his own heart. So
Yeah,
that's what they're saying.
right.
Prognosis, as I don't know what's translated foreknowledge, and is that the only word foreknowledge? Only place foreknowledge is in the word in the Bible?
Um, looks like Acts 2:23. Him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. Yeah, these are the only two. First, or Acts 2:23 and First Peter 1:2.
All right. So in that case, foreknowledge is talking about what? What's going to happen or people? I guess in Acts, excuse me, in First Peter is talking about people. In in Acts chapter 2, what's he talking about? People or
So Acts 2:23, him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken by wicked hands have crucified and slain, who God has raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be holden of it. So it's saying God allowed, based on his foreknowledge and the determinate counsel, he allowed them to crucify Jesus.
foreknowledge of what? Foreknowledge of Jesus or foreknowledge of what they were going to do?
I'd say foreknowledge of their actions.
Not impossible, but I don't know that that's still being used the way that you would say God is using it, or it had to be using it.
Yeah, I don't know if I can go to the Old Testament though, free grace notes or because Hebrew and Greek are not exactly the same. Now, is the gnosko word used in the Septuagint?
No,
Is that the point you're
eh,
trying to make in Jeremiah 15?
no, he's probably saying that God knew Jeremiah before his birth or
Oh,
something
okay.
like that.
Yeah, I don't know.
All right, Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before thou camest
Jeremiah
forth out of
1:5.
the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. But again, that says, doesn't say foreknew, it says he knew him. I would say what I
Sorry,
was
right.
saying
This
is
is Jeremiah 1:5. Sorry, I thought this
there's
said
there's
Jeremiah
no
15.
there's
You're right. It's 1:5. Sorry about that.
so that's a place where he doesn't use the word, well, like you said, Hebrew or
Yeah, I'm not
Greek.
sure how
It's a
the
different word.
LXX translates this, or what Greek it would be. Knew thee.
All right, so I have it's an Old Testament verse. It says God is a God of knowledge, and by him actions away. It doesn't say he's a God of foreknowledge. So if what would be the difference
I mean, but
in
it's ridiculous to say he
knowledge and
doesn't have both.
foreknowledge?
And the Bible makes it clear he has knowledge and foreknowledge.
I don't. Where does it say
We
foreknowledge?
just went
Does
over two verses where it actually uses the word foreknowledge. God has
right?
foreknowledge.
And those are two different words, right? Those were two different words.
That's irrelevant. The point is that you're trying to say he's not a God of
Mm,
foreknowledge, but the Bible does say foreknowledge twice.
okay, what I'm saying it's a different word. There's two different words translated that way.
So
Why
what?
would they translate it that way? I would believe they translated it that way because of the Augustinian paradigm.
Oh, you think the translators are influenced by Augustine, so they translate as foreknowledge.
Yes.
That sounds like a conspiracy theory.
Not a conspiracy theory, but they have going back to the question I asked you before. If we can say that the way Paul used prognosko in Acts 25 is most likely the same way he's using it in Romans 8:29 and also um, Romans 11:2, why is it not translated for no or for new in Acts 26:5?
I don't know. I'm not a Greek scholar.
Because the people who were, shall we say, influenced by Calvin, excuse me, check that, Augustine,
Augustine, yeah,
it didn't fit
yeah.
their purpose to translate it that way. That's if you didn't translate it that way in 26:5 Acts, why would you translate it that way there?
I don't know. I'd have to ask a Greek scholar about that.
All right. So I'm not a Greek scholar, but the word prognosis is a word that I'm pretty sure it has pretty much the same meaning, but men have prognosis, right? Prognosis, if it's foreknowledge, it's not foreknowledge that's limited to God. You have foreknowledge. Excuse me. You can
No,
do a
I don't
prognosis.
know
I can
about
do a
things
prognosis.
I don't know things that happen before they happen. I don't have foreknowledge. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a
You can't you go and look and see what time the sun is going to rise tomorrow?
well, that'd be a different use of the word. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking
Okay,
about having
so
knowledge of about future events.
the sunrise tomorrow is a future event.
Right, but yeah, but that's just general knowledge that anyone can make that kind of prediction. I'm talking about like tomorrow at 8 p.m. President so and so or Ambassador so and so will be assassinated by this guy named blah 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 with this type of weapon, and it's like specific knowledge of things that have not yet occurred.
But the Bible, I don't know that the Bible says that God has that kind of knowledge.
Well, I think that's how God
The
does
place that you
prophecy.
said,
God makes prophecy based off of foreknowledge because He has knowledge of all future things. He can make predictions.
I would say it's not foreknowledge, it's knowledge. Think about in Genesis where God said that he said about Abraham, for I know him that he will keep the way of the Lord and command his household after him to keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment. He says, he doesn't say I foreknow him. He says, I know
Well,
him
then how did God know it? He knew it because
because
He knows the
because
future.
he is he is a God of knowledge is what I'm saying.
That's
God is a God of
foreknowledge.
is not called knowledge, foreknowledge. The
Okay,
verse I'm
man.
thinking about
I'm done.
says
I'm done.
that
Thanks.
okay.
I'm good. Thank you.
All right. So can you sum up what you understand my understanding to be of this passage?
Yeah, the conforming is just God has predestinated to make people types of Christ from the past, essentially, right?
Yeah. That will be about the shortest. You
Okay.
don't mind? Can I just run through it quickly? What I'm saying about the
Sure. Go ahead,
predestination
man.
spoken of. All right.
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
let me try to pull this up so I can read through it.
Do you want me
Or
to
if
share
you,
your screen?
um, let me see something. I just thought of something that was it. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can do this well enough. How do you share screen? Let me see. 2 plus. How do you? I don't know how to share video. No, right here. Click on here. Slides PDF image file. Try this. Okay.
No, just hit so if you hit the share button on the bottom, hit share screen, and then it's going to ask you if you want to share a window, your entire screen, or a Chrome tab. So if you want to share the tab, you click the tab and go on the tab. If you want to share a window, which is something specific, you click the window tab, and then you click on the window you want to share. And then hit the share button, and it'll pop up at the bottom, and I can put it on the screen.
Did it come up? Did I get that right? Okay, hold on. Let me
Yep,
see
there
if
it
I
is.
can get some. All right.
Lorraine Boetner.
Let me just click one more thing and try to do this. Okay, don't know if it comes. All right, so let's start here. All right, there was an issue with your file. Okay, never mind. I'll just read this. It may occasion some surprise to discover that the doctrine of predestination was not made a matter of special study until near the end of the 4th century. They, of course, taught that salvation was through Christ, yet they assumed that man had full power to accept or reject the gospel. They would have denied the doctrine of predestination. They taught a kind of synergism in which there was a cooperation between grace and free will. This cardinal truth of Christianity was first clearly seen in Augustine. Okay, so you can how do you take that out? I guess you can remove that. That's so. Here's what I believe: that, as I said, when Paul spoke to the people in Romans about when he wrote to them, he was writing to people who knew the Old Testament, would have known what he was speaking of, and anyone who didn't had someone available so that they could ask. And so I don't know uh, when people actually got off course, but I think it happened with Augustine. Now, he had some ideas of predestination that he brought into Christianity, just like people have ideas about the creation. There are people who aren't born Christians. They, of course, some people that have become Christians from being atheists, and they bring in what they believe about creation from atheism. In that same way that Augustine brought in ideas about predestination into Christianity. So the church didn't have a doctrine of predestination until Augustine came around. And then after that time, we've seen predestination in a certain light. It's been seen in the light of God's foreknowledge, but predestination is not based on God's foreknowledge. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that. God, you could call it foreknowledge, but since I don't think the Bible calls it foreknowledge, there are words that are translated that way.
Well, the
God,
early church believed that God did everything according to foreknowledge. Actually, there's church quotes from early church fathers like Irenaeus, that everything was done according to the foreknowledge of God. So, because they didn't believe in determinism, and they didn't believe in the predetermination of each individual's destiny either. But they did believe that God did everything according to his foreknowledge. Just wanted to put that out there.
okay, not sure what to say about that, except for then apparently Augustine is not the only one who brought things into Christianity that did not emanate from Christianity. So now predestination is looked at in the light of God's foreknowledge, and to the extent that people say, how can you have foreknowledge and free will? It's one or the other. That comes from a misunderstanding of predestination, and the misunderstanding was caused by Augustine's take, which people followed in his footsteps and propagated his take, which is erroneous. So when God talks about predestination, he is talking about, I need to read this scripture. So the reason why people got off on the wrong foot, and the whole church, I believe, is wrong about these verses. Well, and all of them, like I say, Leighton Flowers, he starts out saying it's about people in the Old Testament. Then he gets to verse 30, and it's a verse about us. So the reason why people are wrong about predestination is because of God's great knowledge. It's not a stretch to say that God knows who's going to be saved, who's not going to be saved, and this, that, and the other. But the Bible doesn't say that God does things on the basis of who is going to be saved and who is not going to be saved. So Paul was talking about suffering, and he says, yes, we're suffering. It's not just us, the whole creation is groaning together. But if we suffer with him, we shall also reign with him. So we're suffering, but things are going to work together for our good. How do we know? Excuse me. Let me
Because
just
God
back
says so.
up. Okay, so let me just look this. When you say because God say so, go back to what I said previously. Everyone in the Bible who wrote referred to things from time to time, referred to things from the Old Testament to make their point. I heard Joel Carrico say that Paul quotes the Old Testament I think it's 68 times in Romans. A lot of those times he's quoting the Old Testament to make his point. For example, when he's trying to make the point that we are saved by faith apart from works, he mentions Abraham. He does it in chapter 4. He quotes the Old Testament. He also mentions David. So he refers back to Old Testament. So Paul didn't say we know that we are saved by faith apart from works because God said so. He didn't do that. He didn't say, I'm going to leave it at this. God said so. That's how we know. He refers back to what has been written before. So he does the same thing in this passage. How do we know that all things? Now, he doesn't quote because there's nothing to quote about. I don't think there's anything to quote about types from the Old Testament. So and when he mentions David in chapter 4, he mentions Abraham. He mentions them separately. Right here in verses 29 and 30, he's mentioning people all together because there are many people in there. Like I say, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. There are many people in those verses. So he's not going to make the citation for each time. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God because we can see that happening in the Old Testament with the types of Christ. The types of Christ are the people who we can see were called, justified, and glorified. And I go on, I've already mentioned how God predestined Jonas to be conformed to the image. I've mentioned how some of the ways that God predestined Noah, some of the ways that God predestined Joseph to be conformed to the image just by the situation that he put them in. So that's what it means to be conformed to the image. Jesus called for a penny. He said, whose image does this penny have? That penny had, coin, we'll just say coin, had the image of Caesar. Well, Caesar's image wasn't naturally on the coin. That coin had to be conformed, conformed, so that it bore his image. Certain things had to happen. Certain things had to happen to Joseph in order for him to bear the image, so that we could see Christ in him, and the same thing with Jonah. So he's just like everyone else does. He makes the statement in verse 28. He backs that up in verse 29 and 30. And then after he's backed it up, the fact that we're suffering, but all things are going to work together for good, he asks the question, what then shall we say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? And the reason why people think that to be conformed to the image of God's Son is talking about us, because yes, God wants us to be like his Son. I don't know that we can find a scripture that says that in so many words, but it just says to say that we are waiting for the redemption of our bodies, but while we're waiting, we're suffering. But even though we're suffering, all things are going to work together for good. We
So,
know that because it worked together
with
for
all due
good for.
respect, though, you didn't really do anything to disprove what I presented. That the being conformed to his image is a reference to the resurrection. You've given me no reason why that can't be the case.
Because he's talking about people of the past and those
Okay,
verbs,
so were
verses,
people in the
verbs,
past
and
have people in the past been conformed to his image, or are they predestined to be at the adoption, the redemption of their bodies? Are they going to be at the final day, the resurrection? The Old Testament
yeah,
people in the past?
yeah,
Okay, so that
yes.
fits in with what I'm presenting too. So there's really nothing in the
Mm,
passage that demands your understanding. That's what
I
I'm
would say
trying to
what
point out.
I'm saying okay, what would make it not fit what I'm saying? What would make it invalid? Just the
Well,
fact that
because you're
is it just
assuming
the fact that I haven't disproven your point of view? Does that make it invalid? What would you say makes my
well, I'm not
take
saying it's
invalid?
invalid. I'm saying that the passage itself doesn't
Okay.
necessitate your understanding because you're
Okay.
packing a lot
Let me
into the word conformed.
let me ask again the different question. I'm not scripturally what would make what I'm saying invalid? Do you have anything scripturally that would make it invalid?
In Romans 8, no.
Okay, so the things that I've said um, that would invalidate what you're saying is that he doesn't mention those things about the resurrection. What did you say? Perfection, not perfection. Being conformed to the image of his son, you're saying that means perfection?
It means it's being a perfect conformity, molded
Mm, okay, how are we molded?
by the
That's
resurrection.
okay. So you right now are molded.
No, that's why it's future. The future resurrection when I get a glorified body.
When you get a glorified body, but this doesn't say that.
It literally says it in verse 23. I've showed it to you at least 5 times already.
And not only that, but we waiting for the adoption. It doesn't say for our bodies to be perfected. We are waiting
Keep reading.
while we're
Keep
okay,
reading.
right. And he's saying that while we're waiting, we're suffering, but all things are going to work
No,
together for good.
you skipped it. You skipped it, man. Listen. Because the creation itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. And not only they, but ourselves also, verse 23, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, so those who have the Holy Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our bodies. Now,
And
I'm arguing that Paul already explained the resurrection here in verse 23. So when you get down to verse 29, when it's talking about being conformed to his image, it's a reference back up to what he already mentioned in verse 23. That's what I'm arguing.
I don't see how you do that.
Okay, and that's fine. Then we just disagree. I don't see any way to move forward here. Um, Past that, so I've heard your point. You've heard mine. I don't have anything else to add.
Okay, well,
All right.
thanks for your time, I guess. Is that it then?
Yeah, that's it. I don't have anything else to add to that, man. I'm just all I wanted from you was something that would show, like within the context of Romans itself, why the conform to his image must be talking about being a type of Christ, rather than just going back up a few verses in the same passage and where it's talking about the adoption. And I don't know, in my opinion, you didn't do that. I guess I can see where you're coming from with your idea here, but I think the passage itself explains what the conforming to his image is. In verse 23, he states it. And then so when we get down here, it's like,
Mm,
oh, he's just referring back up to what he already said. But,
I think
you know,
that's question begging.
okay,
Um,
well, if you say so.
Well, I mean, I did take the time to explain what it means to be conformed and why it's
Well, that's the same thing Charlie Michaels does when you go to Ephesians. When I go to verse 8 and 9, where it's talking about by grace we've been saved through faith, he goes, why are you eisegeting the words from hell? And I go back up to verse 1, and it's talking about, well, we were alienated from God, being dead in our trespasses and sins. So obviously he saved us from that. So the saved refers to being saved from hell. Oh, that's eisegesis. You know, you're doing the same thing here when he talks about we're waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our bodies. And then when he gets down to conform to his image, and you say, well, where are you getting that from? And I say, well, back up in verse 23. And then you go, well, you're just begging the question. Well, okay.
yeah, he started talking about suffering in verse 17, right? And he goes on to say, yeah, we're not the only ones that are suffering. The whole creation is suffering. If we suffer with him, we're going to be glorified together. That's in the future,
Yeah.
yes.
Glorified. That's the redemption of our bodies, the rapture, the resurrection.
Glorified together. Okay. But these people in the past have already been glorified in verse 30. Those verses past tense.
See, that's where it gets interesting, right? Because I would say they're still waiting for it, but then why does God use it in past tense? That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Because he's talking about types of Christ. Those people are dead and gone, and
Yeah,
what
but
he
that's
did
just
for
an
them.
assertion.
There are types of Christ that are not dead and gone.
But wait a second, because didn't Jesus say God is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living? So they're not dead and gone. They're still alive in
Okay,
Christ, right?
they have lived, and they right now the dead know nothing. They know nothing. I put it that way.
Do you believe in soul sleep?
Like I said previously, a whole lot of things I don't have an opinion of. I don't necessarily have an opinion to
Do you
that.
believe that the dead are conscious and aware?
They don't know what we're doing. I don't believe that.
Okay, that's fine. But like, so the people that died in faith, do you believe they're right now in the presence of God, worshiping Him, waiting to be given a new body?
Uh, I don't know. I know in Revelation the people that were dead spoke with God, but is that everyone, or those just the people in the tribulation? Jesus told the parable of the Lazarus being in Abraham's bosom is in the presence of God. I don't know. Don't have a firm
Okay,
stance on that.
okay. Well, I do. I believe that people that died are in heaven. Their spirit, they're absent of a body. They're waiting for God to reunite them with a perfect body. I think that's what they're waiting for. I think that's what Paul's talking about here in Romans 8, is that they're patiently awaiting for the redemption of their bodies, the day of glorification, the thing that we're predestined to after we've believed. So that's fine.
Okay.
That's where I'm coming from. Like, I don't believe in soul sleep. I believe that the people in hell are conscious and aware that they're in hell. You know, stories like Luke 16, the rich man was aware of his surroundings. He was in torment. Um, yeah. So I was just asking to try to get some clarification, but that's okay. I mean, if you're not sure, that's fine, man. That's fine. I really
Okay.
don't have any
Well,
more to add to the subject anyway, so it's whatever.
all right. Well, I think we agreed that verse 29, he's talking about people in the Old Testament. We agreed that the things that make people types of Christ didn't happen by accident, but they were predestined to happen. We agreed that Jesus Christ is the firstborn among many brethren. That is to say, he has the preeminence. He's greater than Solomon, Jonah, Abraham, all of the above, and which he said in a few different ways. And the people are getting this wrong because of God's great knowledge. The Bible says God is a God of knowledge, and by Him actions are weighed. So, excuse me, because of God's great knowledge, it's easy to think that foreknowledge is knowing things that are going to happen. He knows people. He knew people. All right. So if it's people, then God knows everyone. God knew Pharaoh would harden his heart. He just knows everyone. So I don't think that foreknowledge is not talking about an intimate relationship of people of the past or people of the present. The foreknowledge is, or foreknew, whom he foreknew. Those are people in the past, like Josiah, like Hezekiah, like Jehoshaphat. Those are people in the past. Now, I'm not saying those are types of Christ. I'm just saying people of the past, like those people in the past. Easy to get this wrong because of God's great knowledge. But it's a difference in foreknowing what's going to happen and foreknowing a person. I don't think that God loved people before they were born. I don't know. I'm not saying he doesn't or didn't, but I would think
Okay.
you'd have to have that definition in there. All right. Well,
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think God loved people before he has a relationship with them, but I do believe he knows in advance who will trust him and who won't. I believe he does know who will come to intimately know him and who won't. So that's not a problem. But yeah. Well, thanks
all
for
right.
coming on.
So
Any other time you want to join in on a discussion of any other topic, whatever, you're welcome when I do my open mics and things like that. I have a debate tomorrow on compatibilism. I'll be doing an after show. If you want to stop by, you're welcome to.
what time is that?
So the debate will be tomorrow at, I believe, 8:30 my time, which is Eastern. It'll be on Standing for Truth's Ministries YouTube channel. I'll be debating a Calvinist that calls himself Turretin fan. I'll be taking the incompatibilist position. He'll be defending compatibilism. And I'll be having an after show immediately after the debate. So probably around like 10 or 11 my time.
Okay. Not sure. I might
Yeah.
be out in the truck at that time. I guess that the last thing to
Sorry.
ask is I saw that you put, I didn't read them all, but I read some of them. I guess you put some comments on the screen from the chat. I haven't been watching the chat. I don't suppose there's any questions or anything that from the chat or directed my way or anything like that.
No, there
I
was
guess
a quote from Irenaeus from my friend Kelvy put here. This is from
is this the
Irenaeus. I
one?
think it's from his works against heresies. Yeah, our God,
Our God, one
one
and
and
the
the
same.
same. Yeah, go ahead if you want to read it. Sure.
Our God, one and the same, is also their God, who knows hidden things, who knows all things before they come to pass. Knows. For knows or for knows. This person used the word knows, not for knows. You could say to know before and is foreknowledge. I would just say it's knowledge. Who knows all things before they can come to pass. And for this reason, he said, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. So, just if I could, that was not
Sure.
before, that was after. So, what he knew before or said before is the younger shall serve, excuse me, the elder shall serve the younger. He didn't, that, if you put that back up there again, um, that's from Malachi. That's a quote from Malachi, which
No,
is
that's a
well
quote. That's
after.
That's Irenaeus, which is a church father from the early 2nd century. That's a quote
Can you
that
put that?
Irenaeus wrote.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right here where it says, well, Irenaeus is wrong
Hmm. Well,
because now listen to what I'm saying here. He said he knew before it came to pass, but what he said when he said, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated, both of them were, excuse my French, dead and gone by that time. That's a quote from Malachi. So that's after they had lived. Now, they're at least Jacob was around as a nation. I don't know if Esau was around as a nation at that
Edomites.
time,
Yes.
but okay, Edomites, that was after Jacob was buried. That was after Esau had been buried. So that's not before. So Irenaeus says, if he's saying that God said that before they were born, it doesn't say that, but I'm thinking that's what he's thought.
I think
That's a
Irenaeus
quote
is saying
after
that
they were.
he foreknew the men that they would be, and that's why he said he hated one and loved the other. I think that's what
Well,
Irenaeus is
see, then,
getting at.
okay, you're understanding that when God said that, both of them had already lived their lives. So it's not
That's
something he said
fine, but
because he
the
knew.
point Irenaeus is making is that he believed that God made this declaration based on the knowledge he knew of who both these men would turn out to be. I
How
think
can
that's
it
what
be when
Irenaeus
he
is getting
didn't?
at.
Do you
Because God's
understand that?
all-knowing, dude.
Okay, my question to you is: you understand when that was said after they were buried,
That's
and it
fine, but
wasn't said
I'm just trying to
before they
interpret.
lived?
I'm just giving you Irenaeus' perspective. I'm not saying whether I'm in alignment or it's just a quote from
Okay, well,
Irenaeus. I'm just letting you know where he's coming from.
I'm saying Irenaeus was wrong because that was said after those
Okay.
people were buried.
Okay. So you don't believe God knew ahead of time that Esau would be a wild man and that Jacob would listen to God?
I'm saying that God didn't say, I have hated Esau because he knew he would be a wild man. And he didn't say, I have loved Jacob because Jacob was going to be a follower of God. He
Okay.
preferred Jacob over Esau, but that quote is after they were gone. Yes, of course he knew that Esau would be well, actually that was the wild man part was what he said about Ishmael, right? Not Esau. So, but he knew that Esau would serve Jacob. He knew that the elder shall serve the younger, which not based on foreknowledge, just on his knowledge. And maybe we can get Irenaeus. Irenaeus, if you're watching, and you can be in the after show
Don't
tomorrow night.
talk to dead saints, man. Irenaeus. No. Don't do that. Don't be like the Roman Catholics. That's bad.
Thank you for your time.
All right.
Have a nice night. For anyone watching, don't forget to like.
Yep.
And if you're not subscribed to Kevin's Biblical Discussions, feel free to do so. The channel that I'm going to post this on, a couple of them, one is Redefine Apologetics. If you want to go over there and check out some other things I have to say about, well, it's basically the same thing, trying to say it over and over again because I think everyone's wrong. So the more I can try to get this, I believe it's a biblical disambiguation of what is being said. The more the merrier, the more times I can get it out, the best. Even though I shouldn't say it falls on deaf ear, but I would say it's rejected. And I would say it's rejected because of the bad paradigm, even for those who don't particularly care for Augustine. Thank you for your time, Kevin. See, we have the same last name, but I don't know that we're related in any way, shape, or form. But, well, besides being in Christ, brethren,
Yeah.
brothers in Christ, that way. Thank you for your time, sir.
Right,
I will, hold on, let me see something. It says, stay in the studio until your recordings are uploaded. Not sure what that means, but I will let you close out. I'm not going to press this red arrow. I'm going to let you do whatever you're going to do.
All right. Well, thanks for coming in, man, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime. And God bless everyone. Have a good night.
Okay, thanks for watching. Here are some more videos you can watch right there. Be sure to subscribe, and here is a playlist for you. Check that playlist out. Thank you, and God bless you.